Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is Ancient Egypt. Some strange rules that are hard to believe even today. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Egypt. Some strange rules that are hard to believe even today. Ancient Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. For thousands of years, the people of the Nile Valley built enormous temples, mysterious pyramids, powerful kingdoms, and a culture that still fascinates the world today. But behind the golden treasures, royal tombs, and stories of mighty pharaohs, there was another side of ancient Egyptian life. A side filled with unusual traditions, strict rules, strange beliefs, and everyday customs that may seem impossible to understand from a modern perspective. The ancient Egyptians believed that every part of life had a connection to order, balance, and the universe itself. They called this idea Mayat, a concept representing harmony, justice, truth, and cosmic balance. Because of this belief, many rules were not simply laws created by rulers. They were connected to religion, society, and the idea that breaking certain traditions could disturb the balance of the world. Some of these rules were so unusual that even today people find them difficult to believe. For example, cleanliness was not just a personal habit in ancient Egypt. It was almost a sacred duty. Many Egyptians shaved their body hair regularly, including their heads, because they believed hair could collect dirt and impurities. Priests especially followed extremely strict cleanliness routines. Some priests removed body hair completely and washed themselves multiple times a day before performing religious duties. To modern people, this may seem extreme, but for ancient Egyptians, purity was connected to respect for the gods. Their appearance also followed strict cultural expectations. Many people, including men, wore wigs. These wigs were not only fashion items, but also practical solutions. A shaved head was easier to keep clean in the hot Egyptian climate, while wigs protected people from the sun and insects. Another surprising rule was related to food. Ancient Egyptians had many types of food, but certain groups had restrictions. Priests often followed special diets because they believed some foods were unsuitable for sacred duties. Different temples had different rules about what could or could not be eaten. Some animals were also treated in ways that seem strange today. Cats, for example, were deeply respected in ancient Egypt. They were connected with the goddess Bastet, who represented protection, motherhood, and fertility. Hurting a cat could bring severe punishment. Because cats were considered sacred animals, this respect for animals went far beyond cats. Certain animals were believed to represent gods on earth. A sacred animal could receive special care, food, and protection. When such an animal died, it could even receive ceremonial burial.
Another fascinating rule involved death and the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed death was not the end. They believed life continued in another world, and because of this, they created extremely detailed burial customs. Mummification was not simply a method of preserving a body. It was a religious process connected to the belief that the soul needed the body to exist in the afterlife. Because of this belief, there were strict rules about preparing the dead. The body had to be treated carefully. Specific rituals had to be performed, and special objects were placed inside tombs. The tomb itself followed traditions that had existed for generations. Even the position of objects, the words written on walls, and the items buried with the dead had meaning. Ancient Egyptians believed that words had power. Writing was not just communication. Hieroglyphs were considered a powerful form of expression.
The name of a person was especially important. Destroying someone's name could be seen as attacking their existence in the afterlife. This is why some ancient rulers tried to erase the names of their enemies from monuments. They believed removing a person's name could remove their memory and influence forever. Another strange aspect of Egyptian society was the role of the pharaoh. The pharaoh was not seen as an ordinary king. Egyptians believed the pharaoh had a divine connection and was responsible for maintaining order between humans and the gods. This meant the pharaoh had enormous authority. The decisions of the ruler affected religion, politics, farming, and daily life. Many people believed following the pharaoh's commands helped maintain harmony in the world. But even powerful rulers had responsibilities. A pharaoh was expected to protect Egypt, provide justice, and honor the gods. Failure was believed to threaten the entire civilization. Ancient Egyptian society also had strict ideas about social roles. People had different responsibilities depending on their position. Farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, scribes, priests, and nobles all played specific roles. Scribes were especially respected because writing was a rare and valuable skill. They recorded taxes, laws, religious texts, and important events. Learning to read and write was difficult, and those who mastered it gained opportunities for higher positions. The ancient Egyptians also had unusual beliefs about dreams. Dreams were often considered messages from the spiritual world. Some people believed dreams could reveal future events or provide guidance. Special dream interpreters existed who studied symbols and tried to explain their meanings. A dream about certain animals, objects, or events could be interpreted in different ways. To modern thinking, these ideas may appear mysterious, but for ancient Egyptians, dreams were another connection between the human world and the divine world. Their calendar and festivals also followed strict traditions. The Egyptians celebrated many religious festivals throughout the year. These events were not only entertainment, but also important spiritual occasions. People gathered, offered gifts, prayed, and participated in ceremonies. Some festivals included public celebrations where statues of gods were carried through streets. Egyptians believed this allowed the gods to interact with the people. The more we study ancient Egypt, the more we discover that their strange rules were not random.
They came from a civilization that saw the universe as deeply connected. Every action, every ritual, and every tradition had a purpose. Some of their customs may feel unusual today, but they reveal a society that was highly organized, deeply religious, and remarkably advanced. And these are only the beginning. Because ancient Egypt was full of rules about marriage, beauty, medicine, farming, punishment, animals, magic, and even daily habits that would surprise the modern world. The deeper we explore their civilization, the stranger and more fascinating their world becomes. One of the most fascinating things about ancient Egypt is that their rules were not limited to kings, priests, or temples. They existed in almost every part of daily life. From the way people dressed to the way they treated their homes, the ancient Egyptians followed traditions that were deeply connected to their beliefs. For them, life was not divided into separate areas like religion, society, and personal habits. Everything was connected. A simple daily action could have a deeper meaning. One of the most interesting examples was their obsession with cleanliness and appearance. In ancient Egypt, looking clean and well prepared was extremely important. Both men and women used cosmetics, perfumes, and oils regularly. Makeup was not only about beauty, it also had protective and spiritual meanings. The famous dark eye makeup known as kohl was used by many Egyptians. It made the eyes stand out, but people also believed it protected them from harmful influences and certain eye problems. The color and style of makeup could also show a person's status. Wealthier Egyptians had access to better quality cosmetics, expensive perfumes, and fine clothing. Appearance became a way to display social position. Another surprising rule involved clothing. Egypt's hot climate influenced fashion, but clothing still followed cultural expectations. Linen was one of the most important materials because it was light and comfortable. Wealthy people often wore finer, cleaner linen, while ordinary workers wore simpler versions. The quality of fabric, jewelry, and accessories could reveal a person's place in society. Jewelry was also more than decoration. Ancient Egyptians believed certain objects had protective powers. Amulets were worn by many people because they were believed to bring luck, protection, and healing. Different shapes had different meanings. The scarab beetle was one of the most famous symbols. Egyptians associated it with rebirth and regeneration. A small scarab amulet could represent hope for protection in life and the afterlife. Another unusual part of Egyptian culture was their relationship with magic. Magic was not considered imaginary or separate from religion. The ancient Egyptians believed magical words and actions could influence reality. They used spells for protection, healing, and success. Medical treatments often included both practical methods and magical rituals. A doctor might use herbs, tools, and medical knowledge while also reciting words believed to strengthen the healing process. To ancient Egyptians, the physical and spiritual worlds were connected. Their ideas about medicine were also advanced in many ways.
Egyptian physicians studied injuries, diseases, and treatments. They created remedies from plants, minerals, and other materials. Some medical writings from ancient Egypt show detailed observations of the human body. But alongside this knowledge were beliefs that modern people might find unusual. Illness was sometimes connected to supernatural causes, and certain rituals were used as part of treatment. Another strange tradition was the importance of names. In ancient Egypt, a person's name was considered a powerful part of their identity. The name was connected to memory and existence. This belief explains why many tombs and monuments contained names written repeatedly. Egyptians wanted their names to continue existing for eternity. They feared that if their name disappeared, their memory could disappear too. This idea also affected punishment. One of the harshest forms of punishment was not only physical but symbolic, destroying a person's name or images. For an Egyptian, losing their name from history could be a terrible fate. Marriage customs in ancient Egypt were also interesting. Unlike some later societies, women in ancient Egypt had many legal rights. They could own property, make agreements, and in some cases control their own wealth. Marriage was often based on practical agreements between families, but love and companionship were also valued. Ancient Egyptian art shows couples together, often presenting images of family life. However, society still had expectations about family roles and responsibilities. Children were considered very important because family connections played a major role in Egyptian life. Having children was seen as a way to continue the family line. Another unusual belief involved animals and their connection to humans. Many animals had religious importance. The crocodile, for example, was both feared and respected. Because of its connection with the Nile and certain gods, crocodiles had a complicated place in Egyptian culture. Some crocodiles were kept in temples and treated with great care. Others were hunted because they could threaten human life. This shows how ancient Egyptians could see the same animal as both dangerous and sacred. The Nile River itself had many rules and traditions around it. The Nile was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. It provided water, transportation, farming opportunities, and food. The yearly flooding of the Nile was seen as a powerful natural event that brought fertility to the land. Farmers depended on this cycle. Without the Nile, the great civilization of Egypt could not have existed. Because the river was so important, many religious beliefs developed around it. The Egyptians believed the natural world was influenced by divine forces. The sun was also extremely important. The daily movement of the sun across the sky was connected with ideas of life, death, and rebirth. The rising sun represented renewal, while the setting sun was connected with the journey into another world. This belief influenced their temples, art, and burial practices. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where every symbol carried meaning. A simple animal, a piece of jewelry, a written word, or a daily ritual could represent something much bigger. Many of their rules seem strange only because modern societies see the world differently.
For ancient Egyptians, these traditions created order. They believed that following the right customs helped humans live in harmony with nature, society, and the gods. But some of their rules were even more surprising, including unusual beauty practices, strange beliefs about death, royal traditions, and everyday laws that shaped millions of lives along the Nile. Ancient Egypt was a world where traditions controlled almost every moment of life. From birth to death, people followed customs that had been passed down for generations. Many of these traditions were so deeply rooted that questioning them was almost impossible. One of the most surprising areas of Egyptian culture was their attitude toward beauty and the human body. Today, beauty standards change constantly, but in ancient Egypt, appearance was connected with health, status, and even spirituality. Both men and women cared greatly about their appearance. They used oils to keep their skin soft, perfumes to smell pleasant, and cosmetics to enhance their features. The hot desert environment made skincare especially important. People used natural ingredients like oils and minerals to protect their skin from the harsh climate. But beauty was not only about looking attractive. Ancient Egyptians believed that maintaining the body was a way of showing respect for themselves and the world around them. Hair was another interesting part of their culture. Many Egyptians removed body hair, and this practice was especially common among priests. They believed unwanted hair could carry impurities. Priests had some of the strictest cleanliness rules in society. Before entering temples and performing rituals, they followed careful washing routines. Their dedication to cleanliness was extreme compared with many other ancient civilizations. Another strange tradition was the use of wigs. Many people shaved their heads and wore wigs instead. These wigs could be made from human hair or plant fibers. For wealthy Egyptians, wigs became fashionable and could be decorated with accessories. They also helped protect the head from the intense Egyptian sun. The idea of beauty also influenced clothing. Egyptians preferred clean, bright clothing, especially among the upper classes. White linen was highly valued because it looked pure and elegant. Clothes were often carefully maintained, and wearing dirty or damaged clothing could affect how a person was viewed socially. Another surprising area was ancient Egyptian law. The legal system was based on maintaining order and justice. The concept of Mayat influenced ideas about truth and fairness. A person was expected to be honest because dishonesty was believed to disturb the balance of society. Lying, stealing, and harming others were considered serious offenses, but punishments could be strict. Depending on the situation, punishments could include fines, physical punishment, forced labor, or even death. The goal was not only to punish individuals, but also to protect social order. The ancient Egyptians also had interesting rules about work. Most people in Egypt were farmers, and farming followed the rhythm of the Nile River. The flooding season changed the entire way of life. When the Nile flooded, fields became rich with new soil. After the waters went down, farmers planted crops. Because agriculture was so important,
Farmers had responsibilities to maintain the land and produce food. The government carefully recorded resources because feeding the population was essential for the survival of the kingdom. This is where scribes became extremely important. Scribes were among the most educated people in ancient Egypt. They recorded taxes, laws, religious texts, trade, and government activities. Writing was considered a powerful skill, and scribes often enjoyed higher social status. The ancient Egyptian writing system itself was fascinating. Hieroglyphs were not simply letters. They included symbols representing sounds, objects, and ideas. A single symbol could have multiple meanings depending on context. Because writing was connected with knowledge and power, scribes held an important place in society. Another unusual belief was connected to the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort preparing for death because they believed the next life was a continuation of this one. They buried people with objects they might need. A wealthy person's tomb could contain furniture, jewelry, tools, food, and other items. The idea was that the dead person would continue their existence in another world. This belief created one of the most famous practices in history: mummification. The process of preserving the body was complex and required special knowledge. Egyptians believed the body needed to remain recognizable so the soul could reunite with it. The organs were also treated carefully during the process. Certain organs were removed and stored in special containers known as canopic jars. Each jar had symbolic meaning and was connected with protection. The heart had a particularly important role. Egyptians believed the heart was connected to a person's identity and morality. In their beliefs about the afterlife, the heart was judged to determine whether a person lived peacefully forever. A person's actions during life mattered greatly. They believed people had to live according to truth and balance. This shows how morality was deeply connected to religion in ancient Egypt. Another fascinating rule involved tomb decorations. The paintings and writings inside tombs were not simply art. They were believed to have power. Images of food, servants, animals, and daily activities were created because Egyptians believed these representations could help provide for the dead. A painted meal could symbolically become a real offering in the afterlife. A picture of an object could represent its existence beyond death. To modern people, this idea may seem unusual, but it was a central part of Egyptian beliefs. Even the location and design of tombs followed traditions. Important people wanted their resting places to reflect their status. The larger and more impressive the tomb, the greater the person's position in society. This is why Egypt's landscape became filled with monuments that still amaze the world thousands of years later. The strange rules of ancient Egypt were not random habits. They were part of a civilization that believed every action had consequences. Their world was built around balance, tradition, and the connection between humans and the universe. And as we continue exploring ancient Egyptian customs, we discover even more unbelievable rules about royal families, animals, marriage, religion, and everyday survival.
Ancient Egypt was a civilization where even ordinary objects could have extraordinary meanings. A simple piece of jewelry, a small statue, or a written symbol could represent protection, power, or a connection with the gods. This belief shaped the way Egyptians lived their entire lives. One of the most fascinating examples was their belief in protective objects called amulets. Amulets were worn by people from many levels of society. Some were made from simple materials, while others were created from precious stones and valuable metals. The purpose was not only decoration. Many Egyptians believed these objects could protect them from illness, danger, or bad luck. Different symbols had different purposes. The Eye of Horus was one of the most famous protective symbols. It represented healing, protection, and restoration. People wore it because they believed it could guard them against harm. The scarab beetle was another powerful symbol. The Egyptians noticed how scarab beetles rolled balls of earth and believed this represented the movement of the sun across the sky. Because of this connection, the scarab became a symbol of rebirth and renewal. A small beetle-shaped charm could represent the hope for a new beginning. Another unusual belief involved statues. Ancient Egyptians created many statues of gods, kings, and important people, but these statues were not always viewed as simple decorations. Some Egyptians believed statues could serve as a connection between the physical world and the spiritual world. A statue placed in a temple or tomb could have a deeper purpose. This explains why ancient Egyptian statues were created with such care and detail. They were not only artistic creations, they were part of religious practice. The Egyptians also had very specific ideas about the human soul. They believed a person was made of different spiritual parts. One important part was the Ka, which was believed to be a life force. Another was the Ba, often described as a person's personality or individuality. The afterlife depended on these spiritual elements being properly cared for. This is why burial rituals were so important. Without the correct ceremonies, Egyptians feared the person might not achieve a peaceful existence after death. Another surprising tradition was the use of offering rituals. Families often left food, drinks, and gifts for deceased relatives. They believed the dead could still benefit from these offerings. This connection between the living and the dead remained important for generations. Egyptians did not view death as a complete separation. They saw it as a transition. The relationship between the living and the dead continued. Ancient Egyptian families also had traditions about remembering ancestors. A person's memory was extremely valuable. Being remembered meant continuing to exist in a symbolic way. This is why monuments, inscriptions, and family traditions were so important. Another strange part of Egyptian society was their attitude toward animals. While many animals were respected, some were feared. The Nile River contained dangerous creatures, including crocodiles and snakes. Yet these same creatures could also have religious meanings. The Egyptians had a complicated relationship with nature. They feared the dangers of the natural world, but also respected its power. They believed animals could represent forces beyond ordinary human understanding. This connection between animals and religion was everywhere. Certain animals were connected with specific gods.
The ibis bird was associated with knowledge and writing because it was connected with the god Thoth. The falcon was linked with kingship and the sky because of its connection with Horus. The jackal was connected with the afterlife because of its association with Anubis, the god of mummification. These beliefs influenced art, rituals, and daily behavior. Another unusual aspect of ancient Egyptian life was their view of medicine and healing. Egyptian doctors had practical knowledge, but healing was also connected with spiritual beliefs. A treatment might include physical remedies and magical words. They believed the mind, body, and spiritual world were connected. Some medical texts show that Egyptian healers carefully observed injuries and illnesses. They describe wounds, treatments, and symptoms in impressive detail. For their time, some of their medical knowledge was surprisingly advanced, but they also used remedies that modern people might find unusual. Certain mixtures included strange ingredients because Egyptians believed symbolic power was important. The ancient Egyptians also had unique ideas about green time. Their calendar was based on the cycles of nature, especially the Nile flooding. The year was divided into seasons connected with farming. Their understanding of astronomy was also highly developed. They watched the stars and used them for navigation and timekeeping. The movement of the stars influenced their architecture and religious beliefs. Many temples and monuments were built with careful attention to the sky. This shows how closely ancient Egyptians connected the earth and the universe. Another fascinating rule involved speaking and writing. Words were believed to have power. The written word was not simply information. It could influence reality. This belief explains why magical texts, prayers, and names were treated with such importance. A written symbol could be considered more than an image. It could carry spiritual force. Ancient Egyptians also believed that some names had special power. Royal names were especially important. Pharaohs often had multiple names connected with their role and divine status. These names reflected their relationship with the gods and their position as rulers. The pharaoh's name was carefully preserved on monuments because it represented their eternal identity, from birth to death. Ancient Egyptians followed rules that connected every part of existence. Their traditions may seem strange today, but they reveal a civilization that was deeply thoughtful about life, nature, and the mysteries of existence. However, some of their most surprising rules were connected to the royal family, the power of pharaohs, unusual marriage customs, and the hidden secrets of palace life. Among all the traditions of ancient Egypt, the life of the royal family was perhaps the most unusual. The pharaoh was not simply a political leader. The Egyptians believed the pharaoh stood between the human world and the world of the gods. This belief created a completely different way of thinking about kingship. The pharaoh was expected to protect Egypt, maintain order, and keep harmony
between people and divine forces. Because of this responsibility, the ruler's actions were surrounded by rituals and traditions. Almost every part of royal life had meaning. Even the pharaoh's clothing, crown, and ceremonies were carefully designed to show power and connection with the gods. The crown itself was not just a symbol of authority. Different crowns represented different aspects of Egyptian rule. The pharaoh's appearance was carefully controlled because people believed the ruler represented something greater than an ordinary human being. Another surprising tradition was the idea that royal blood needed to remain special. In some periods of ancient Egyptian history, royal families practiced marriages between close relatives. This may seem shocking today, but their beliefs about royalty were different. They wanted to preserve the royal line and maintain the connection between the ruling family and the divine. For them, the royal family was not only a political family, but also a sacred one. Marriage in ancient Egypt itself had interesting rules. Unlike some societies where marriage was controlled only by strict religious authorities, Egyptian marriages were often practical agreements. People married to create families, share responsibilities, and continue their family lines. Women in ancient Egypt had more legal rights than women in many other ancient civilizations. They could own property, inherit wealth, and sometimes manage their own affairs. This makes ancient Egypt especially interesting because social roles were not always what modern people might expect. Another unusual custom involved beauty and aging. Egyptians cared about preserving youth and appearance. They created cosmetics, perfumes, and skincare methods that were advanced for their time. Some beauty treatments involved ingredients that modern people would find strange. They used natural materials from plants, minerals, and animals. The goal was not only to look attractive, but also to appear healthy and respected. Ancient Egyptian society placed great value on presentation. A person who looked clean and well-dressed was often viewed more positively. The Egyptians also had interesting ideas about entertainment and leisure. Although their civilization was famous for temples and tombs, people also enjoyed music, dancing, games, and celebrations. Music was an important part of festivals and ceremonies. Musicians used instruments like harps, flutes, and drums. Entertainment was not seen as separate from culture. It was part of social life. Children also played games. Archaeologists have discovered toys and objects that show ancient Egyptian children enjoyed activities similar to children today. This reveals a more human side of ancient Egypt. Beyond the monuments and mysteries, they were ordinary people with families, hobbies, and emotions. Another fascinating rule involved food and dining. Food was an important part of Egyptian life. Bread and beer were basic parts of the diet for many people. The Nile provided fish, while farming produced grains, fruits, and vegetables. Wealthier Egyptians had access to more variety, including meat and sweet foods, but food also had religious importance. Offerings of food were made in temples and tombs. Egyptians believed food had a role in supporting both the living and the dead.
Their relationship with beer was especially interesting. Beer was not only a drink for celebration, it was a common part of daily life. Many workers received beer as part of their provisions. To ancient Egyptians, beer was often safer and more reliable than untreated water because the brewing process reduced some risks. Another strange aspect of Egyptian culture was their belief in fate and destiny. They believed the universe followed a certain order. This did not mean people had no choices, but it meant actions had consequences. Living according to Ma'at was considered the correct path. A person who acted dishonestly or unfairly was believed to move away from the natural balance of the world. This idea influenced their laws, religion, and personal behavior. The Egyptians also had unusual beliefs about dreams and visions. Dreams were sometimes treated as messages. A person might seek interpretation if they had a powerful or confusing dream. Special dream interpreters studied symbols and gave explanations based on tradition. A dream involving certain animals, objects, or situations could have different meanings. For example, some dreams were considered signs of good fortune, while others were warnings. The boundary between the physical and spiritual world was very thin in Egyptian thinking. Another surprising tradition was the use of curses. Ancient Egyptians believed words could create effects. Some tomb inscriptions included warnings against people who disturbed the resting place. These were not simply threats. They reflected a genuine belief that written words carried power. The idea of curses became famous in later stories about Egypt, but the original beliefs were connected to their understanding of magic and the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians also had strict ideas about respect. Respect for parents, elders, traditions, and authority was highly valued. Family connections were important, and children were expected to honor their parents. The family was one of the foundations of Egyptian society. They believed strong families helped maintain stability. When we look deeper into ancient Egyptian rules, we discover that many of them were connected by one major idea. The world needed balance. Their unusual traditions were attempts to protect that balance. Whether it was a beauty ritual, a burial ceremony, a royal tradition, or a simple daily habit, Egyptians believed every action had meaning. And still, many mysteries remain. Some of their rules about death, magic, animals, and hidden rituals continue to surprise historians today. The deeper we explore ancient Egypt, the more we realize that this civilization had a completely different way of understanding the world. Their rules were not only about controlling society, they were about creating a connection between humans, nature, and the unseen forces they believed surrounded them. One of the most fascinating areas of Egyptian tradition was their relationship with temples. Temples were not simply places where people gathered to pray. They were considered the homes of the gods on earth. Because of this belief, temples followed extremely strict rules. Only certain people were allowed to enter specific areas. The inner sections of temples were usually reserved for priests and important religious ceremonies. Ordinary people could not simply walk into every part of a temple. The priests who served in these temples lived according to demanding routines. They had to maintain purity,
perform rituals correctly, and follow rules about clothing, cleanliness, and behavior. A mistake during a ceremony was not considered a simple error. It could be seen as disrespect toward the gods. This shows how seriously Egyptians treated religion. Another unusual belief was that statues of gods needed daily care. Priests would perform rituals involving washing, dressing, and presenting offerings to statues. To modern people, this may seem surprising, but Egyptians believed the statue represented the presence of the deity. The rituals were a way of maintaining the relationship between humans and the divine. The Egyptians also had special rules connected to festivals. Religious festivals were some of the biggest events in society. During these celebrations, statues of gods were sometimes carried outside temples so ordinary people could see them. People believed these moments allowed them to come closer to the divine world. Festivals included music, food, dancing, and ceremonies. They were both religious and social events. Another strange part of ancient Egyptian culture was their belief in sacred animals. Some animals were treated with extraordinary respect. A sacred animal connected to a god could live in a temple and receive special care. When the animal died, it could be mummified and buried with ceremonies similar to those given to humans. Animal mummies have been discovered in large numbers, showing how important animals were in Egyptian religion. But this respect did not mean all animals were protected equally. Some animals were feared because they were dangerous. The Egyptians understood the difference between sacred animals and threats to human life. Their relationship with nature was complex. They respected the power of animals while also recognizing danger. Another surprising aspect of ancient Egyptian life was their attitude toward death. Many civilizations feared death as an ending. The Egyptians saw death as a transformation. They believed a person continued existing in another form. This belief shaped almost everything they did. The construction of tombs, the preservation of bodies, and the creation of burial objects all came from this idea. The famous pyramids were not simply giant buildings.
They were part of a much larger belief system about kings, eternity, and the afterlife. The pyramid represented the importance of the pharaoh and the desire for eternal existence. Building such monuments required enormous organization. Workers, architects, engineers, and craftsmen all contributed. The process itself shows how advanced Egyptian society was. Another unusual tradition was the use of magical texts. Ancient Egyptians created collections of spells and instructions meant to guide the dead through the afterlife. These writings were placed in tombs and on burial objects. They were believed to help the deceased overcome dangers and reach a peaceful existence. The journey after death was imagined as a challenging path. The dead person needed protection and knowledge. This is why magical words were considered extremely valuable. The Egyptians also believed that images could have power. A painting or carving was not always viewed as just art. An image of food could represent actual nourishment. An image of servants could represent assistance. An image of a person could help preserve their existence. This belief explains the detailed artwork found inside many tombs. Every picture had a purpose. Another interesting rule involved memory. Ancient Egyptians wanted their achievements remembered. Kings built monuments with their names because they wanted future generations to know about them. A person's legacy was extremely important. Being forgotten was considered a terrible fate. This is why Egyptians invested so much effort into writing, monuments, and preservation. They were creating a bridge between their time and the future. Their ideas about the body were also unique. The human body was not viewed only as a physical object. It was connected with identity and spiritual existence. This explains why mummification became such a detailed process. Preserving the body was preserving the person. Every step had religious meaning. Another fascinating part of Egyptian tradition was their understanding of time. They carefully watched the stars and the movement of the sun. Astronomy helped them create calendars and organize agricultural activities. The flooding of the Nile was predictable, and understanding the seasons was essential for survival. Their knowledge of the sky influenced architecture as well. Some monuments were built with careful alignment to celestial events. The connection between earth and sky was a major part of Egyptian thinking. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization that separated science and spirituality in the same way many people do today. Their observations of nature, their engineering, and their religious beliefs existed together. This combination created one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. But the strange rules of Egypt did not end with temples and tombs. There were also unusual rules about workers, punishment, family life, medicine, and even what people believed happened after their final breath. The next part will explore even more surprising traditions that shaped everyday Egyptian life. Ancient Egyptian society was built on order. Every person from the most powerful pharaoh to the simplest farmer had a role to play. The Egyptians believed that when everyone performed their responsibilities, the world remained balanced. This idea of balance influenced their work, their laws, their families, and even their ideas about justice. One of the most interesting parts of ancient Egyptian life was the way they viewed workers. For a long time, many people imagined that the great monuments of Egypt were built only by enslaved people. But the reality was much more complex. Many workers were organized into groups, provided with food, housing, and supplies. Large construction projects required careful planning and management. Workers had specific duties, and skilled craftsmen were highly respected. Stone workers, painters, builders, and artists all contributed to the creation of Egypt's greatest monuments. Their work followed strict standards because mistakes could affect the final result. The Egyptians believed quality mattered. A badly made object or poorly completed ritual could disturb the intended order. This attention to detail can still be seen thousands of years later in their surviving temples and tombs. Another surprising part of ancient Egypt was their approach to education. Education was not available equally to everyone. Most children learned skills from their families, but those who became scribes received special training. Becoming a scribe was considered a path to a better life. Scribes learned reading, writing, mathematics, and administration. Because written records were essential to government, scribes became powerful members of society. Their knowledge gave them opportunities that many others did not have. The ability to write was seen almost like having a special power. Another unusual tradition involved the use of animals in daily life. Animals were not only religious symbols, they were also important parts of farming, transportation, and survival. Donkeys helped carry goods, cattle helped with agriculture, and fish from the Nile provided food. The Egyptians depended on animals, but they also gave many of them symbolic meanings. This connection between practical life and religion was everywhere. Even farming had religious significance. The yearly flooding of the Nile was one of the most important events in Egyptian life. The flood brought water and fertile soil, allowing crops to grow. Farmers depended on this natural cycle. The Egyptians saw the Nile as a blessing and connected it with divine forces. Without the river, their civilization would have been completely different. Another strange belief involved the power of certain objects. Egyptians often placed small statues, charms, and symbols in homes and tombs. They believed these objects could influence events. A protective symbol might guard a person from danger. A statue might represent a connection with a god or ancestor. Objects were not always seen as lifeless. They could carry meaning and purpose. Ancient Egyptians also had interesting ideas about the home. The household was an important part of life. People decorated their homes with practical items, but they also used objects connected with protection and tradition. Family life was highly valued. Parents wanted children to continue the family name and traditions. Respect between family members was considered important. Another surprising rule was related to honesty. The Egyptians believed truth was one of the most important qualities a person could have. In their religious beliefs, the dead were judged after death. A person's heart was weighed against the symbol of truth. This represented the idea that a person's actions mattered. Someone who lived dishonestly could face consequences in the afterlife. This belief encouraged people to follow moral behavior. Another fascinating tradition was the importance of the heart. Unlike modern ideas that connect personality mainly with the brain, Egyptians considered the heart the center of a person's thoughts, emotions, and character. They believed the heart contained the essence of a person. This is why the heart was treated differently. During mummification, it had special importance. Ancient Egyptians also had rules about communication. Speaking respectfully was valued. Insults, lies, and harmful words were taken seriously. Since words were believed to have power, people understood language as something that could affect reality. A spoken promise or written statement could carry great importance. Another unusual part of Egyptian culture was their interest in the future. They looked for signs in nature, dreams, and religious practices. Some people believed they could receive warnings or guidance from the gods. This was not unusual in their society. The boundary between everyday life and the spiritual world was very thin.
The Egyptians believed the gods could influence everything from the harvest to personal success. Another fascinating aspect was their relationship with rulers after death. A pharaoh's death did not mean the end of their importance. Their tomb, statues, and monuments continued their presence. The dead ruler was still remembered and honored. This belief helped explain why so much effort was spent on royal burials. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where memory, tradition, and belief shaped everything.
Their rules may seem strange from a modern viewpoint, but each one reflected their understanding of existence. They were trying to create a world where humans, nature, and the gods remained connected. And the more we uncover about Egypt, the more we discover traditions that challenge our understanding of the ancient world. From mysterious royal ceremonies to unusual medical practices and forgotten daily habits, there are still many secrets waiting to be explored. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where even the smallest details of life could carry meaning. What people ate, how they dressed, what they wrote, and how they treated others were often connected to deeper beliefs about order and balance. One of the most interesting examples was their approach to personal hygiene. The Egyptians lived in a hot desert environment, and cleanliness became an essential part of daily life. But their idea of cleanliness was not only practical, it was also spiritual. Many Egyptians washed frequently and used oils and perfumes to maintain their bodies. They believed an unpleasant smell or an unclean appearance could reflect a lack of discipline. Perfume was especially important. Fragrances were used by ordinary people and royalty alike. They were made from flowers, plants, oils, and other natural materials. For wealthy Egyptians, perfume could show status. For religious ceremonies, certain scents were believed to please the gods. The Egyptians also had unusual traditions involving teeth and health. They did not have modern dental care, but they created mixtures to clean their mouths. Some ancient recipes included powdered materials combined with herbs. Their methods were different from today, but they understood that taking care of the body was important. Another fascinating rule involved food preparation. Food was not only about survival. Meals were connected with family life celebrations and religious offerings. Bread was one of the most important foods in Egypt. It was eaten by people from all levels of society. Beer was also common. It was consumed by workers, families, and communities. To ancient Egyptians, beer was often considered part of daily nutrition rather than only a luxury. The Nile also provided fish and other resources. Agriculture created a stable food supply, allowing Egyptian civilization to grow. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian life was their belief in animals as symbols. The appearance or behavior of certain animals could have meaning. A bird flying in a certain direction or an animal appearing at a certain moment could be interpreted as a sign. The Egyptians carefully observed nature. They believed the natural world contained messages. This belief influenced decisions, ceremonies, and traditions. Another important part of Egyptian culture was the role of priests. Priests were responsible for maintaining relationships with the gods. They performed rituals, cared for temples, and followed strict rules. Their lives were different from ordinary citizens.
They had to follow special cleanliness practices and sometimes avoided certain foods or activities. Their responsibilities were considered extremely important because they were believed to support the balance of the universe. Another surprising tradition was the use of statues representing the dead. Families sometimes placed statues in tombs because they believed they could serve as a place where the spirit could exist. The statue was connected with the person's identity. This belief explains why Egyptian artists created such detailed images. The goal was not simply beauty, it was preservation. Ancient Egyptians wanted the individual to continue existing. This desire for eternity influenced their entire civilization. Their buildings, writings, and artwork were created to last. Another fascinating subject was Egyptian ideas about magic and protection. Magic was part of everyday life. People used protective words, symbols, and objects. A person might wear an amulet for safety. A family might use a charm to protect their home. A traveler might carry something believed to bring good fortune. Magic was not considered separate from religion. It was another way of interacting with the forces they believed shaped the world. The Egyptians also believed certain names and words had special power. This belief extended into their stories and religious texts. A name represented identity. To know something's true name was believed to give a person power over it. This idea appears in many ancient Egyptian myths. Another unusual rule involved the treatment of criminals and enemies. Punishment was often connected with restoring order. The goal was not only revenge, it was to correct behavior and protect society. Because Egyptians believed disorder threatened everyone, maintaining stability was extremely important. Another surprising aspect of Egyptian culture was their understanding of beauty in art. Egyptian artwork followed strict rules. Artists did not usually create images exactly as they appeared in real life. Instead, they followed traditions that showed the most important features clearly. This is why Egyptian paintings often look different from modern paintings. The style was designed to communicate meaning, not just appearance. The size of figures in artwork often represented importance. A pharaoh might be shown larger than other people because of their higher status. This was not about realistic proportions. It was about showing social and spiritual importance. Ancient Egypt also had unusual ideas about time and history. They believed preserving the past was important. Records, monuments, and inscriptions helped maintain memory. The past was not forgotten. It remained connected to the present. This is one reason Egyptian civilization left such a strong impact on the world. Their strange rules were actually reflections of their deepest beliefs. They were not simply random traditions. They came from a worldview where every action had meaning. Every ritual, every symbol, and every object had a purpose. And still, some of the most unbelievable Egyptian rules were connected to their views on death, resurrection, hidden rituals, and the mysterious journey after life. Among all the beliefs of ancient Egypt, none was more powerful than their fascination with life after death. While many ancient cultures feared the unknown world beyond life, The Egyptians spent thousands of years developing detailed traditions about what happened after a person died. Death was not seen as a final ending. It was considered a journey. Because of this belief, ancient Egyptians created some of the most complex burial customs in human history. The process of preparing the dead was surrounded by strict rules. A body could not simply be buried without proper ceremonies. The Egyptians believed every step mattered. The preservation of the body was essential because they believed the soul needed a recognizable form. This belief led to the creation of mummification. Mummification was not just a method of keeping a body from decaying. It was a sacred process. Special people trained in burial practices carefully prepared the body according to traditions that had existed for centuries. The body was treated with oils, materials, and rituals. The goal was to help the person continue their existence in the afterlife. Another unusual rule was the importance of burial objects. Ancient Egyptians placed many items inside tombs. To modern people, it may seem strange to bury someone with furniture, jewelry, food, or tools, but Egyptians believed these objects could be useful beyond death. A tomb was prepared almost like a new home for eternity. The wealthier the person, the more elaborate the burial could become. Royal tombs were especially impressive because pharaohs were believed to have a unique connection with the divine. Their deaths were important events for the entire kingdom. Another fascinating belief involved the journey after death. Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a world with challenges. The dead person needed guidance and protection. Religious texts and spells were created to help them pass through dangerous stages. These writings contained instructions, prayers, and magical words. They were considered essential tools for the journey. Another strange belief was the judgment of the dead. The Egyptians believed a person's heart would be examined after death. The heart was weighed against the symbol of truth. If the person had lived a good and balanced life, they could enter a peaceful afterlife. If not, they faced consequences. This shows how strongly Egyptians connected morality with eternity. A person's actions in life mattered even after death. Another important rule involved remembering the dead. Families continued to honor deceased relatives. They brought offerings, maintained tombs, and spoke about their ancestors. Being remembered was extremely important. A person who continued to live in memory was believed to have a form of eternal existence. This explains why names were preserved so carefully. Ancient Egyptians feared being forgotten. To them, memory was almost a form of immortality. Another unusual part of Egyptian belief was their idea of rebirth. The cycle of the sun influenced their understanding of life. Every morning the sun appeared again after disappearing at night. The Egyptians saw this as a symbol of renewal. The daily movement of the sun became connected with ideas of death and rebirth. Nature itself became a reflection of spiritual beliefs. The Nile also represented renewal. Every year, its flooding brought new life to the land. The Egyptians saw this cycle and connected it with the idea that life could continue after death. Another fascinating tradition was the creation of large monuments. The pyramids and temples were built not only for practical reasons, but also to represent eternal power. They were designed to survive for generations. Their massive size reflected the importance of the people they honored.
The Egyptians wanted their achievements to remain visible forever. Another strange practice was the use of small statues called ushabti. These figures were placed in tombs. Egyptians believed they could serve the dead person in the afterlife. The idea was that these small figures could perform work on behalf of the deceased. A simple object became part of a much larger spiritual system. Another surprising belief involved animals in tombs. Some people were buried with animal remains or animal representations. These animals could have symbolic meaning or represent protection. The relationship between humans and animals continued, even after death. Ancient Egypt was a society where the boundary between the living world and the spiritual world was very thin. Their rules about death were not based on fear alone. They were based on the hope that existence continued. They wanted life, identity, and memory to survive forever. This desire for eternity is one reason ancient Egypt still fascinates people today. Their monuments remain, their writings remain, their stories remain. Thousands of years later, their beliefs still raise questions about how humans understand life and death. But ancient Egyptian rules were not only about the afterlife. They also had fascinating traditions about medicine, daily work, family relationships, and even strange habits that people followed every day. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where everyday life was filled with traditions that connected the ordinary with the extraordinary. A person waking up in the morning, preparing food, going to work, caring for family, or visiting a temple was often following customs shaped by thousands of years of belief. One of the most interesting areas of Egyptian life was medicine. Ancient Egyptian medicine was a mixture of observation, experience, and spiritual belief. Egyptian healers studied the human body carefully. They treated injuries, created remedies, and recorded medical knowledge. Some of their ideas were surprisingly advanced for their time. They understood that different illnesses required different treatments. They used plants, minerals, bandages, and other materials to help patients. But alongside practical medicine, they also believed supernatural forces could influence health. A person's illness might be connected with spiritual problems, and healing could include prayers or magical words. To the Egyptians, physical and spiritual health were connected. Another unusual medical tradition involved protection during childbirth. Childbirth was an important event, but it was also considered dangerous. Egyptian women used protective objects and rituals because they believed these could guard both mother and child. The birth of a child was seen as the continuation of the family line. Children were highly valued. Families hoped their children would carry on traditions and remember their ancestors. Another fascinating part of Egyptian life was the way they viewed names. A name was more than a label.
It was connected with identity. A person's name represented their existence. This is why Egyptians placed so much importance on writing names correctly and preserving them. A destroyed name was considered a terrible punishment because it attacked a person's memory. This belief was especially powerful among rulers. Pharaohs built monuments with their names because they wanted future generations to remember them. Another strange tradition involved royal monuments and political power. When a new ruler came to power, they sometimes changed or replaced the names and images of previous rulers. This was not only about politics. Because names and images had spiritual importance, controlling them was a way of controlling memory. Ancient Egyptians understood that history itself was powerful. Another interesting part of society was their attitude towards servants and workers. Households, especially wealthy ones, included many workers with different responsibilities. Some prepared food, some managed homes, and others worked in specialized roles. The organization of Egyptian society depended on cooperation between different groups. Everyone had a position within the larger system. Another unusual tradition involved celebrations. The Egyptians loved festivals. Although ancient Egypt is often imagined as serious and mysterious, people also enjoyed music, dancing, and gatherings. Festivals allowed communities to come together. They were moments of happiness, not only religious duty. Music was everywhere. It was used during ceremonies, celebrations, and daily life. Musicians were respected, and instruments were common among wealthy households. Another surprising aspect was the importance of jewelry. Jewelry was worn by both men and women. It was used to show wealth, beauty, and status, but it also had protective meanings. Certain stones and symbols were believed to carry special powers. A necklace or bracelet could be both decoration and protection. Another unusual belief involved colors. Colors had symbolic meanings. Gold was associated with the gods and eternity. Green represented life and renewal. Black could represent the fertile soil of the Nile and the idea of rebirth. White was connected with purity. Artists used colors carefully because they believed colors communicated deeper meanings. Another fascinating Egyptian tradition was their approach to architecture. Buildings were not created randomly. Temples, tombs, and monuments were designed according to strict principles. Direction, alignment, and symbolism all mattered. Architecture was another way of creating harmony. The Egyptians believed a well-designed structure could reflect the order of the universe. Another strange part of Egyptian thinking was their understanding of dreams. Dreams were sometimes considered messages from another world. Some people believed certain dreams predicted events or revealed hidden truths. Dream interpretation became an important practice. A dream could influence decisions, especially when connected with a religion. Another surprising rule involved animals in daily life. Cats were especially valued. They were associated with protection and were respected in many households. But cats were not only religious symbols. They were useful animals because they helped control pests. This shows how practical and spiritual beliefs often existed together. Ancient Egyptians had a unique ability to combine everyday needs with a religious meaning. A simple action could have multiple purposes. A meal could feed the body and honor the gods. A piece of jewelry could be beautiful and protective. A monument could honor the dead and preserve memory. Their world was full of layers of meaning. The strange rules of ancient Egypt were not simply unusual habits from the past. They were part of a complete worldview. A worldview built around balance, survival, memory, and the hope for eternity. And even after thousands of years, many of their traditions remain mysterious. There are still forgotten customs, hidden beliefs, and surprising rules that reveal how different and yet how human ancient Egyptian society truly was. The more we study ancient Egypt, the more we understand that this civilization was not only about pyramids and pharaohs. It was a society where ordinary people lived according to traditions that had been carefully preserved for generations. Their rules were connected to survival, religion, family, and the desire to maintain harmony. One of the most important parts of Egyptian life was the idea of order. The Egyptians believed the universe worked because everything had its proper place. The sun rose and set. The Nile flooded and returned. The seasons changed. The stars moved across the sky. To them, these natural patterns proved that the world was controlled by a greater balance. Humans also had to follow this balance. This belief influenced how they treated each other. Respect and responsibility were considered essential qualities. Another interesting part of Egyptian society was their view of justice. Justice was not only about written laws, it was connected with morality. A person who cheated, stole, or harmed others was believed to create disorder. The purpose of punishment was to restore stability. This idea was deeply connected with Mayat, the principle of truth and balance. Another unusual tradition involved oaths and promises. Words had great importance. When a person made a promise, it was taken seriously. Breaking an oath could damage their reputation and create social problems. Because speech was considered powerful, Egyptians were careful about what they said. Another fascinating part of life was the role of farmers. Farmers were the foundation of Egyptian civilization. The Nile allowed agriculture to flourish, but farming required careful timing. Planting and harvesting followed the river's cycles. Farmers understood the environment because their survival depended on it. Their work was connected with the entire kingdom. The success of farmers meant food for everyone. Another surprising rule involved taxation. The Egyptian government collected resources from the population. Taxes could be paid through goods such as grain, animals, or other products. Because record keeping was important, scribes carefully documented these exchanges. This created a highly organized administration. Ancient Egypt was one of the earliest examples of a complex state system. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian life was the importance of handwriting and written records. The ability to write was not common among everyone. Those who mastered writing had special opportunities. Scribes worked in government, temples, and businesses. Their skills made them valuable members of society. Writing allowed Egypt to manage a huge civilization for thousands of years. Another fascinating tradition involved storytelling. Stories were used for entertainment, education, and religion. Egyptians told tales about heroes, gods, and mysterious events. These stories helped pass ideas from one generation to another. They were not just entertainment. They carried lessons about life, morality, and the relationship between humans and the divine. Another strange belief involved the power of images. Egyptian artists followed traditional styles because images were meant to communicate specific ideas. A person's position, size, and clothing in artwork could show their importance. Art was a language. It explained the world according to Egyptian beliefs. Another interesting part of Egyptian society was fashion. Clothing was practical because of the climate, but it also showed social identity. Different styles, materials, and jewelry could reveal a person's status. Appearance was a way of communicating without words. Another surprising tradition was the use of ceremonial objects. Kings and priests carried special items during important events. These objects represented authority and connection with the gods. They were symbols of power. Another unusual aspect of ancient Egypt was their attitude towards the unknown. Instead of ignoring mysteries, they created explanations. The stars, animals, dreams, and natural events around them all became part of their understanding of existence. They looked for meaning everywhere. This curiosity helped them develop impressive knowledge in astronomy, architecture, medicine, and mathematics. Their beliefs and their observations often worked together. Another fascinating subject was Egyptian mathematics. They needed mathematics for building, measuring land, collecting taxes, and organizing resources. Their calculations helped create some of the greatest monuments in history. The precision of their architecture shows how advanced their knowledge was. Another strange but important tradition was the preservation of personal belongings. People valued objects connected with their identity. This is why tombs often contained everyday items. Egyptians believed the dead person could continue using them. A comb, a chair, a tool, or a piece of jewelry could represent a connection to the person's life. The goal was not only to preserve a body, it was to preserve a complete existence. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built on memory. They wanted their names, stories, achievements, and traditions to survive. Thousands of years later, their monuments still stand as proof of that desire. But there were still many more surprising rules hidden in their society. Rules about magic, royal ceremonies, animals, relationships, and the mysterious beliefs that shaped the final moments of life. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where the visible world and the invisible world were believed to exist side by side. People did not separate daily life from spiritual beliefs. A farmer, a craftsman, a soldier, or a ruler could all believe that their actions had effects beyond what they could see. This belief created many traditions that seem unusual today. One of the most fascinating examples was the Egyptian belief in protection. Life along the Nile brought many challenges.
There were dangerous animals, illnesses, accidents, and unpredictable events. Because of this, Egyptians used protective symbols everywhere. They wore amulets, decorated homes with symbols, and used special words believed to provide safety. Protection was not only a physical matter, it was also spiritual. Another strange tradition involved small, magical figures placed in homes and tombs. These objects were believed to have special purposes. Some represented protection. Others represented servants or helpers for the afterlife. To modernize, they may look like simple statues, but for Egyptians, they carried meaning and power. Another interesting part of Egyptian culture was their belief that the body had to be treated carefully after death. They believed different parts of a person continued to have importance. The body, the name, the memory, and the spiritual elements all needed protection. This explains why burial traditions were so detailed. The Egyptians were not simply preserving a body. They were trying to preserve a whole identity. Another unusual idea was that the dead could still influence the living. Ancient Egyptians believed deceased family members could continue to have a relationship with their descendants. Families respected ancestors and sometimes made offerings to them. The boundary between life and death was not viewed as a complete separation. The dead remained part of the family's world. Another fascinating tradition involved royal ceremonies. A pharaoh's public appearances were carefully planned. Everything from clothing to symbols was designed to communicate authority. The ruler was expected to represent stability. A weak or unsuccessful ruler was not only a political problem, people believed it could threaten the balance of the entire kingdom. Another surprising aspect of Egyptian royalty was the importance of temples. Pharaohs built and supported temples because religion was connected with their power. A ruler who honored the gods was believed to maintain harmony. Temples were not just religious centers. They were also places of learning, administration, and economic activity. Another unusual tradition involved offerings. People gave gifts to temples because they believed offerings helped maintain relationships with the gods. Offerings included food, objects, and valuable materials. These gifts supported religious institutions and showed respect. Another interesting part of Egyptian life was the way they viewed animals after death. Animals could also be mummified. Millions of animal mummies have been discovered, showing how important animals were in religious practices. People offered animal mummies as gifts connected with specific gods. This tradition shows how deeply animals were connected with Egyptian beliefs. Another surprising aspect was their view of dreams. Dreams were sometimes considered a form of communication. A dream could be interpreted as advice, a warning, or a message. Some Egyptians kept records of dreams and their meanings. The dream world was considered important because it connected humans with forces beyond ordinary life. Another unusual belief involved the stars. Egyptians watched the sky carefully. Stars were not only useful for navigation and calendars, they were also connected with religious ideas. The night sky represented part of the larger universe that humans were trying to understand. This connection between astronomy and spirituality influenced Egyptian architecture. Another fascinating area was Egyptian craftsmanship. Artists and builders followed traditions that were passed down through generations. They learned techniques from earlier masters. Innovation existed, but tradition was highly valued. The goal was often to create something that matched the ideal established by ancestors. Another strange rule involved the importance of preserving traditions. Ancient Egyptians respected the past. They believed older customs contained wisdom. Changing traditions too quickly could be seen as dangerous because it might disturb the balance of society. This respect for the past helped their civilization remain stable for thousands of years. Another important part of Egyptian life was family. Families were central to society. Parents taught children skills and traditions. Children were expected to respect their parents. Family connections continued even after death through remembrance and offerings. Another surprising thing about ancient Egypt is that many of their beliefs were not only for the wealthy. Ordinary people also participated in religious traditions. Although kings built huge monuments, common people also used symbols, prayers, and rituals in their daily lives. Religion was part of everyone's world. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization built only by powerful rulers. It was created by millions of ordinary people who followed traditions, worked, raised families, and believed they were part of a larger cosmic order. Their strange rules reveal something important. They were trying to understand life. They wanted answers about nature, death, morality, and the universe, and while some of their customs may seem impossible to believe today, they show a society that was deeply organized, creative, and thoughtful. The mysteries of Egypt continue, because every discovery reveals another piece of their incredible world. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that believed every action, every object, and every word could have a deeper meaning. Their traditions were not simply habits. They were part of a complete system that connected humans with nature, society, and the divine. One of the most interesting examples was the Egyptian belief in symbols. Symbols were everywhere. They appeared on walls, jewelry, statues, clothing, and everyday objects. To Egyptians, symbols were a way of expressing ideas that could not always be seen. A symbol could represent life, protection, power, or eternity. The famous Ankh symbol, often associated with life, became one of the most recognizable signs of ancient Egypt. It represented the idea of existence and vitality. Another important symbol was the Djed pillar. It was connected with stability and strength. Egyptians believed symbols like these carried powerful meanings. Another surprising tradition involved the preparation of temples. A temple was not simply built as a gathering place. Its design often reflected Egyptian ideas about the universe. The layout, decorations, and location all had importance. The temple was considered a sacred connection between humans and gods. Because of this, every detail mattered. Another unusual rule was that priests followed strict routines before entering sacred areas. They washed their bodies carefully, wore specific clothing, and performed rituals
Purity was essential. A priest was expected to approach the gods in the correct state. This shows how seriously Egyptians viewed religious responsibility. Another fascinating aspect of Egyptian society was their relationship with medicine and magic. A healer might use practical knowledge and spiritual methods together. For example, treating a wound could involve physical care, as well as spoken formulas. The Egyptians believed words could influence the outcome. This combination of observation and belief made their medicine unique. Another surprising part of Egyptian life was their attitude toward aging. They respected experience and wisdom. Older people were often valued because they carried knowledge from previous generations. In a civilization that placed great importance on tradition, experience was considered powerful. Another interesting tradition involved celebrations of life. Egyptians did not only focus on death and the afterlife, they also enjoyed living. Paintings show scenes of music, dancing, hunting, feasting, and family gatherings. These images reveal that ancient Egyptians valued happiness and pleasure. Their culture was not only about tombs and temples, it was also about everyday human experiences. Another unusual aspect was their understanding of animals in art. Artists carefully chose animals because each one could represent an idea. A lion might symbolize strength. A falcon might represent the sky or kingship. A snake could represent danger or transformation. Animals were part of a larger symbolic language. Another fascinating tradition was the use of written spells. Certain texts were believed to provide protection or guidance. Writing was considered powerful because Egyptians believed words could affect reality. A written message was more than information. It could be an action. Another surprising belief involved the afterlife journey. Egyptians imagined the dead traveling through different challenges. The deceased needed knowledge, protection, and preparation. This is why tombs contained texts and objects meant to help them. The afterlife was not automatic. The person had to be prepared. Another strange tradition was the preservation of royal bodies. The bodies of rulers were treated with extreme care. The goal was to allow the pharaoh to continue existing forever. Royal tombs were designed to protect their remains and their memory. The Egyptians believed a king's eternal existence was connected with the stability of Egypt itself. Another important part of Egyptian culture was their respect for the Nile. The river was the center of life. It provided water, transportation, farming, and resources. The Egyptians watched its patterns carefully. Their entire calendar was connected with the river's cycles. The Nile was not just a river, it was the reason their civilization existed. Another surprising tradition involved the way Egyptians recorded history. They created inscriptions on stone because they wanted events to be remembered. Their monuments became messages from the past to the future. Thousands of years later, those messages are still being read. Another unusual belief was that destruction could have spiritual consequences. Damaging a monument or removing a name was considered more than physical damage. It could affect the person's memory and existence. This is why names were protected so carefully. Ancient Egyptians understood that humans disappear, but memory can survive. Their civilization was built around the idea of lasting forever. The pyramids, temples, statues, and writings were all attempts to defeat time. And in many ways, they succeeded. Thousands of years later, the world is still fascinated by their achievements. The strange rules of ancient Egypt may seem unbelievable, but they reveal a civilization that was searching for answers to the biggest questions. What is life? What happens after death? How should humans live? How can order be maintained? Their answers were different from ours, but their curiosity was surprisingly familiar. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where people believed that life was a journey guided by rules, traditions, and unseen forces. Their understanding of the world was built around a powerful idea. Everything had a purpose. The movement of the sun, the flow of the Nile, the growth of crops, the birth of children, and even death itself were all parts of a larger system. This way of thinking influenced every generation of Egyptians. One of the most fascinating traditions was their belief in the power of the spoken word. Words were not considered ordinary sounds. They could create, protect, and influence. This belief was especially important in religious ceremonies. Priests recited specific words because they believed the correct pronunciation and order mattered. A mistake could change the meaning or reduce the power of the ritual. This shows how seriously Egyptians treated language. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian life was the importance of written records. They recorded everything from royal achievements to everyday transactions. Taxes, farming, trade, and legal agreements were written down. Writing allowed Egypt to manage a massive civilization. The scribes who created these records were among the most important workers in society. Another surprising tradition was the way Egyptians viewed the future. They believed humans could receive signs from the world around them. Dreams, animals, natural events, and unusual occurrences could be interpreted as messages. People looked for meaning in things that happened around them. This was not considered strange in their society. It was part of understanding the universe. Another fascinating belief involved the connection between humans and gods. The Egyptians did not imagine the gods as distant beings. They believed the gods could influence daily life. A successful harvest, a safe journey, or a healthy family could all be connected with divine favor. This is why people made offerings and performed rituals. They believed maintaining a relationship with the gods was important. Another unusual tradition was the creation of huge statues. Statues of kings and gods were made on a massive scale. These were not only artistic achievements, they were statements of power and presence. A large statue showed importance and permanence. The Egyptians wanted their rulers and beliefs to remain visible forever. Another interesting part of Egyptian culture was their approach to clothing and appearance. Cleanliness was highly valued. People used oils, perfumes, and cosmetics regularly. A clean appearance showed discipline and respect. This was especially important for people involved in religious duties. Another surprising custom was the use of ceremonial clothing. Priests, officials, and rulers wore specific clothing during important events. These clothes represented their roles. The appearance of a person could communicate their position in society. Another fascinating part of Egyptian life was their understanding of death rituals. The burial process involved many stages. The Egyptians believed every stage helped the person continue their journey. The tomb, the objects, the prayers, and the body preservation all had specific purposes. Nothing was done without meaning. Another unusual belief involved the importance of statues inside tombs. A statue could represent the person and provide a place for their spirit. This belief explains why Egyptian statues often look calm and timeless. They were designed to represent eternal existence. Another interesting tradition was the connection between food and religion. Food was not only consumed by the living, it was also offered to the dead and the gods. Egyptians believed offerings maintained relationships between different worlds. A simple meal could become part of a spiritual practice. Another surprising part of Egyptian society was the role of animals in households. Cats, dogs, birds, and other animals could be companions as well as symbols. Animals were part of daily life. Their importance went beyond religion. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian thinking was their belief that the past remained alive. They respected ancestors and earlier generations. Old traditions were valuable because they carried wisdom. This respect for history helped preserve Egyptian culture for thousands of years. Another fascinating thing about ancient Egypt was their ability to combine creativity and structure. Their art followed rules. Their buildings followed mathematical principles. Their rituals followed exact traditions. Yet within these rules, they created some of the most impressive achievements in human history. The strange rules of ancient Egypt were not simply restrictions. They were a way of creating stability. The Egyptians believed that without order, everything could fall into chaos. Their traditions were attempts to protect the world they knew. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that many of these beliefs were followed not only by kings and priests, but by ordinary people. Farmers, workers, families, and craftsmen all lived within this system. Their world was mysterious, but it was also deeply organized. The ancient Egyptians left behind more than monuments. They left behind a way of thinking about life, death, and humanity itself. Ancient Egypt's traditions survived for thousands of years because they were deeply connected to the everyday lives of its people. These customs were not only followed during special ceremonies, they shaped how Egyptians understood themselves and their place in the universe. One of the most remarkable things about ancient Egyptian society was the importance of balance. The Egyptians believed the world was always at risk of falling into disorder. The forces of chaos were always present, and human beings had a responsibility to maintain harmony. This belief influenced their laws, religion, and personal behavior. A person who acted honestly and respectfully was helping maintain the balance of the world. Another fascinating tradition was their respect for the dead. In many societies, death creates a complete separation between the living and the dead. But in ancient Egypt, the relationship continued. Families remembered their ancestors, visited tombs, and made offerings. The dead were still considered part of the family. This connection between generations was one of the strongest parts of Egyptian culture. Another unusual belief involved the importance of preserving the body. The Egyptians believed the physical form was connected to a person's identity. Without proper preservation, they feared the person's existence could be affected. This is why mummification became such a detailed practice. The body was treated with respect because it represented the person who once lived. Another surprising aspect of Egyptian burial traditions was the attention given to ordinary people. While royal tombs are the most famous, many ordinary Egyptians also followed burial customs. Different people had different levels of preparation depending on their resources, but the desire for a proper afterlife was widespread. Another fascinating part of Egyptian society was their understanding of the universe. They watched the stars, the sun, and the changing seasons. Their observations helped them create calendars and plan agricultural activities. Their knowledge of astronomy was connected with their religious beliefs. The sky was not just a place of stars. It was part of a larger spiritual system. Another unusual tradition involved the relationship between humans and the gods. The Egyptians believed the gods influenced the world, but humans also had responsibilities. People were expected to honor traditions, perform rituals, and live according to accepted values. The relationship between humans and gods was based on respect and responsibility. Another interesting aspect was the role of temples in society. Temples were not only religious buildings, they were also centers of economic activity, education, and administration. They stored resources, employed workers, and helped organize communities. A temple was one of the most important institutions in Egyptian life. Another surprising tradition involved the use of sacred animals. Some animals were connected with specific gods and received special treatment. The Egyptians believed these animals represented divine qualities. Their deaths could lead to special ceremonies and burial practices. This shows how deeply religion influenced their view of nature. Another unusual part of Egyptian culture was their fascination with eternal life. Many civilizations sought power or wealth, but Egyptians focused heavily on permanence. They wanted their names, achievements, and identities to continue. Their monuments were built to survive time itself. The pyramids and temples were physical expressions of this desire. Another fascinating tradition was the use of art as communication. Egyptian paintings and carvings were not created only for beauty. They told stories, recorded events, and preserved beliefs. The walls of tombs and temples were like books made from stone. They allowed future generations to understand Egyptian life.
Another surprising thing about ancient Egypt is how much their traditions influenced later civilizations. Their ideas about architecture, writing, medicine, and religion became part of human history. Even today, their symbols and stories remain recognizable around the world. Another unusual belief was that objects could continue serving a purpose after death. Furniture, tools, jewelry, and personal items were placed in tombs because Egyptians believed they could be useful in the next world. The tomb was prepared as a continuation of life. Another fascinating tradition involves the relationship between rulers and the people. A successful pharaoh was expected to protect Egypt and maintain stability. The ruler was judged by their ability to preserve order. Power came with a responsibility. Ancient Egyptians did not see leadership as only privilege. It was also a duty. Another interesting aspect of Egyptian life was their patience and long-term thinking. They built monuments that required generations of effort. They created traditions designed to last. Their civilization shows a remarkable ability to think beyond a single lifetime. The strange rules of ancient Egypt reveal a society that was deeply connected to ideas of eternity, balance, and meaning. Their customs may seem unusual today, but they were logical within their own worldview. They were trying to answer questions that humans still ask. How should we live? How do we face death? How do we leave something behind? Ancient Egypt's answer was simple. Create order. Preserve memory. Respect the forces greater than yourself. And that belief helped create one of the most unforgettable civilizations in human history. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. And one reason it survived so long was because its people believed strongly in tradition. They did not see old customs as outdated. They saw them as a connection to the wisdom of previous generations. The past was not something forgotten. It was something respected. This respect for tradition shaped almost every part of Egyptian society. One of the most interesting examples was their approach to craftsmanship. Egyptian artists and builders followed methods that had been passed down through generations. A craftsman was expected to learn from those who came before. Creating something according to tradition was considered a sign of skill. Their artwork followed specific rules because they believed certain forms carried meaning. Another fascinating tradition was the way Egyptians represented important people. In their paintings and carvings, size was often connected with importance. A pharaoh or powerful official might appear larger than others. This was not a mistake. It was a visual way of showing social and spiritual status. Another unusual belief involved the power of images. A picture was not only a representation, it could have a connection with the thing it showed. This is why Egyptians carefully created images in tombs and temples. They believed these images helped preserve the person or event they represented. Another surprising part of Egyptian culture was their relationship with writing. Hieroglyphs were treated with great respect. The ability to write was considered valuable knowledge. Scribes were not simply record keepers. They were people who controlled information. Their skills gave them influence in government and society. Another fascinating aspect of daily life was the importance of farming. The majority of Egyptians depended on agriculture. The Nile controlled their world. When the river flooded, it brought fertile soil. When the water returned, farmers planted crops. This cycle shaped the Egyptian calendar and lifestyle.
The river was the foundation of civilization. Another unusual tradition was the way Egyptians measured time. They created systems to track seasons and events. Their understanding of the year helped them organize farming and religious festivals.
Their observations of nature became part of their culture. Another surprising belief involved the idea that certain places had special power. Temples, tombs, and sacred locations were not considered ordinary spaces. They were believed to have connections with the divine. Entering these places often required respect and preparation. Another fascinating tradition was the use of offerings. People gave offerings because they believed giving created a relationship. A gift to a god, ancestor, or temple showed respect. Offerings were not simply transactions. They represented connection. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian society was their belief in transformation. The Egyptians saw change as part of existence. The sun disappeared each evening but returned every morning. Plants died and grew again. The Nile flooded and renewed the land. These natural cycles influenced their ideas about human life and death. Another interesting tradition involved protection during travel. Egyptians traveled along the Nile and across deserts. Travel could be dangerous. People used prayers, symbols, and protective objects when going on journeys. They believed preparation required both practical planning and spiritual protection. Another surprising part of Egyptian culture was their interest in animals beyond religion. They studied animals, used them in farming, and observed their behavior. Animals were part of their environment and their beliefs. The Egyptians understood that nature was powerful. Another fascinating subject was their idea of the ideal life. A successful life was not only about wealth, it was about living properly. A person who respected family, followed traditions, and acted honestly was considered to be living in harmony. Another unusual belief was that humans had responsibilities even after death. The dead person's continued existence depended partly on proper remembrance and rituals. This explains why families maintained connections with ancestors. Another important tradition was the preservation of royal history. Kings recorded their achievements because they wanted future generations to know their stories. Their monuments became permanent messages. Thousands of years later, we can still read those messages. Ancient Egypt's strange rules reveal a civilization that saw meaning everywhere. A river was not only water. A statue was not only stone. A name was not only a word. Everything could represent something greater. This way of thinking created a world full of symbols and traditions. And perhaps the most amazing part is that many of these ideas continued for thousands of years, shaping one of the longest lasting civilizations in history. But there were still more unusual beliefs hidden in ancient Egyptian society, including forgotten customs,
about magic, relationships, royal power, and the mysterious rules that guided people from birth to eternity. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that created one of the most detailed systems of beliefs the world has ever seen. Their rules were not written only in books. They were carved into stone, painted on walls, passed through families, and taught from one generation to another. For Egyptians, tradition was a bridge between the past and the future. One of the most fascinating parts of Egyptian life was their belief that every person had a connection with the universe, the stars, the sun, the river, the animals, and the changing seasons were all connected. Humans were not separate from nature. They were part of a larger order. This belief influenced how Egyptians built their cities, temples, and monuments. Another surprising tradition was the importance of the direction and position of objects. Egyptians believed placement mattered. A statue facing a certain direction, a temple aligned with the sky, or a tomb positioned in a specific way could have deeper meaning. Their world was carefully organized. Another unusual belief involved the journey of the sun. The Egyptians watched the sun disappear every evening and return every morning. They saw this as a powerful symbol of renewal. The daily cycle of the sun influenced their ideas about death and rebirth. The sun became one of the most important symbols in Egyptian civilization. Another fascinating tradition was the worship of different gods connected with different aspects of life. Some gods were associated with the sky. Others represented fertility, protection, wisdom, or the afterlife. The Egyptians believed different divine forces influenced different parts of existence. This created a rich religious system filled with stories and rituals. Another unusual part of Egyptian culture was the role of priests in maintaining rituals. Priests had responsibilities that required discipline. They followed specific schedules and rules because they believed rituals had to be performed correctly. The smallest detail could matter. Another interesting tradition involved the celebration of important events. Egyptians marked religious festivals, royal events, and seasonal changes. These gatherings strengthened community connections. People came together through shared traditions. Another surprising aspect of Egyptian life was their respect for skilled workers. Craftsmen who created jewelry, statues, paintings, and tools were essential to society. Their skills were valued because they helped preserve Egyptian culture. Many craftsmen worked in groups and passed their knowledge to younger generations. Another fascinating tradition involved the use of colors in decoration. Colors were chosen carefully. They were not random artistic choices. Each color could communicate ideas about life, death, power, or purity. Egyptian artists used color as another language. Another unusual belief was connected with the afterlife and personal possessions. People wanted their belongings to continue with them. This is why tombs often contained objects from everyday life. A person's identity was connected with the things they used. Another surprising part of Egyptian society was their belief in protection from unseen dangers. They used symbols, prayers, and rituals because they believed invisible forces could affect their lives. Protection was a normal part of daily existence. Another fascinating area was ancient Egyptian architecture. Their buildings were designed to last. They used strong materials and careful planning. The goal was permanence. A monument was not just built for the present, it was created for future generations. Another unusual tradition was the recording of royal family histories. Egyptians carefully documented rulers, achievements, and important events. They understood that memory was powerful. A person or ruler could continue to influence the world through remembrance. Another interesting aspect was the importance of education. Learning was especially valuable among those who became scribes. Knowledge created opportunities. The ability to read and write allowed people to participate in government and administration. Another surprising belief was that the spoken and written word could influence reality. This idea appeared in religious texts, names, and magical practices. Words were treated with respect because Egyptians believed they carried force. Another fascinating tradition was their understanding of healing. They combined practical knowledge with spiritual beliefs. A healer might examine a physical problem while also using traditional rituals. They believed true healing required attention to both body and spirit. Another unusual aspect of Egyptian life was their connection with ancestors. Family members who died were not completely gone. They remained part of the family's memory. This relationship between generations was very important. Ancient Egypt's strange rules were not created to make life complicated. They were attempts to create meaning. The Egyptians wanted to understand their world and their place within it. They created traditions that answered questions about nature, society, and existence, and even after thousands of years, their ideas continue to fascinate historians and researchers. The civilization of Egypt remains one of humanity's greatest examples of how belief, creativity, and organization can combine to create something that lasts forever. After exploring the strange rules, traditions, and beliefs of ancient Egypt, one thing becomes clear. This civilization was far more complex than simple stories of pyramids and pharaohs. Ancient Egypt was a world built on ideas. Ideas about life, ideas about death, ideas about nature, and ideas about the connection between humans and the universe. Their customs may seem unusual today, but they were created from a deep desire to understand existence. The Egyptians believed that the world needed balance. The sun had to rise, the Nile had to flow, the seasons had to change, families had to continue, kings had to rule, and people had to live according to truth and responsibility. This belief in balance shaped everything. It influenced their laws, their religion, their art, their buildings, and their daily habits. Many of their strange rules came from this single idea. A person's actions could affect the world around them. This is why cleanliness mattered. This is why words mattered. This is why names mattered. This is why traditions mattered. Yet the Egyptians believed nothing was meaningless. A small symbol could represent protection. A simple ritual could represent respect. A written name could preserve someone's existence forever. Their understanding of death was perhaps the most famous part of their culture. Unlike many societies that viewed death as the end, Egyptians imagined it as a journey. They prepared for it carefully. They preserved bodies. They created tombs. They wrote instructions. They buried objects. They believed identity could continue beyond physical life. This desire for eternity is one reason ancient Egypt left such a powerful legacy. Their monuments still stand. Their artwork still speaks. Their writings still reveal their thoughts. Thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand them. Their rules about animals also show how unique their worldview was. Animals were not simply creatures. They could represent powerful ideas. Some were connected with gods. Some were symbols of protection. Some were respected because they played important roles in nature. The Egyptians saw the natural world as something full of meaning. Their relationship with the environment was a mixture of respect, fear, and admiration. Their approach to knowledge was equally fascinating. They developed skills in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and writing. Their achievements were not created by accident. They came from careful observation and generations of learning. The same civilization that created mysterious rituals also created impressive scientific knowledge. Ancient Egypt was a place where science and spirituality existed together. Today, many of their beliefs may feel strange, but they reveal something universal about humanity. Every civilization tries to answer the same questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? How should we live? How do we leave something behind? The Egyptians answered these questions in their own way. They built monuments that touched the sky. They preserved memories in stone. They created stories that survived thousands of years. Their strange rules were actually reflections of their hopes and fears. They wanted protection. They wanted meaning. They wanted order. And most importantly, they wanted to be remembered. That may be the greatest mystery of ancient Egypt. A civilization that disappeared thousands of years ago is still alive in the imagination of the world. The pyramids, temples, statues, and writings continue to tell their story. They remind us that human beings have always searched for answers beyond themselves. Ancient Egypt was not only a civilization of gold, tombs, and kings. It was a civilization of dreams, beliefs, and ideas. A civilization that looked at the world and saw something greater. And that is why even today, the strange rules of ancient Egypt remain some of the most fascinating traditions ever created by humanity.